Today we're talking about the criteria under the section control environment. And the control environment is referring to the overarching business conditions under which the program operates. And there's a lot of overlap there between IT governance and security governance, but there's a few things to point out when saying it that way. First is that I don't want to give the impression that SOC 2 or even this section of SOC 2 is something that falls under the sole responsibility of IT and InfoSec. This is really referring to the entire organization and everyone and every process within it. And second, this is far from the only section of SOC 2 where governance plays a huge role. And I don't want to give the impression that it's limited to just this video, just this section. With that said, let's look at the individual requirements. So 1.1, the entity demonstrates a commitment to integrity and ethical values. Right off the bat, what this is truly getting at is the idea that security and really the entire business decision is top down. The board of directors, and at least in this organization, there is a board of directors. There might not be in yours. Makes it known to the employees at large, including senior management, middle management, individual contributors, everyone downstream from whatever the top level entity is, what the expectations are in terms of things like ethics and behavior and attitude towards not just information security, but just business as a whole. And the way that this is normally done is through the use of a section in the employee handbook, and often there's an ethics section in that. And in addition to just having it, there's a couple other things to make sure. One is, do you have evidence that everyone down here has read and bought into it? Is there a document showing that they reviewed it? Is there some kind of GRC system that makes them look at it before grabbing access to anything? And in addition to just reading it, are you holding everyone accountable to following things in it, right? Did you set it and forget it, or are you actually actively working on these day to day? And one of the ways to demonstrate that is to show that there is some kind of progressive discipline involved. If you have employees who are violating company ethics, even if they're following the rest of the job description to the letter, if there are ethics problems, is that spelled out in the handbook that can lead to discipline up to and including termination? I mean, obviously consulting with HR on the specifics of your environment, but the overarching theme for this is that the ethics expectations are set by the highest level in the organization, that they're communicated down, that the down level participants know and acknowledge what those are, and that there are consequences for not adhering to those values. And we're going to stay on the same diagram for 1.2. Board of Directors demonstrates independence from management and exercises oversight the development and performance of internal control. That's a lot. What does that really mean? So this is obviously focusing on the board. And what it's saying is, does the board or its equivalent in your organization have the relevant expertise to be able to do things like ask the right questions of senior management? So if your board is formed of individuals who are not well versed in information security, do they acknowledge that and bring in a third-party consultant if needed? Do they ask someone else in the organization to help set the information security? Do they ask a colleague? Are they aware of their own expertise? And in technology companies, this is often not an issue in the MSP industry, right? Very often the company is run by someone who was a former engineer, so it's very easy to demonstrate background knowledge and show that, yes, we do have the requisite expertise. on staff to properly evaluate and ask the right questions of management. One topic here, though, that I'd like to address is there are a lot of organizations that don't have a board of directors. What do you do then if there's no formal body? Well, there's a couple ways to handle it, and the most common way is to have a committee, right? A group of individuals who are responsible for information security, and it needs to be a pretty formal thing. You want there to be a real charter behind it and have some real authority to do this. And if you do this by committee, one thing that you want to make sure is that you don't just make a committee of your managers, of your board members. You really do want there to be some members of that who are not the same people responsible for implementing the control environment. And so one of the points of focus in this talks about independence from management, and that's because it's difficult for management to evaluate their own performance in terms of properly implementing all of the controls and properly securing the environment. So if you can demonstrate that this committee is not just rubber stamping everything, then that's a great way to satisfy this if you are an organization that doesn't have a formal board of directors. So 1.3, this is so long, I'm not going to read it. This is all about structure. We're talking about formalized structure. So if you're a smaller organization, you might have your owner who who has direct reports of the support manager, project manager, sales manager, maybe some other functions, finance, HR, that kind of thing. If you are a bigger organization, you might have above this middle managers. You might be broken up into discrete business units, completely separate geographic locations. Just what your organization structure looks like, and is it formally documented in the form of something like an org chart? Obviously, is one way to get to it. And the reason that this is important is that this gets into, does everybody understand how the big statements that were made up here, right, all the ethics things, the things in the employee handbook, how does that translate into what I need to do day to day? If I'm on support taking a phone call, do I know how what I agreed to translates into my actual day to day job description? And job description is one of the things that will be looked for when this is being audited. And for MSPs in particular, this is the first time, though not the only time, when in SOC 2 where separation of duties comes up. So who's responsible for what? Are the support desk people taking care of your internal IT? Are they taking care of your clients with different people doing internal IT? No right or wrong to this, although I do have an opinion on it, but do you have it defined is the most important question. And so this is all about your job descriptions, your committee charters, your department charters, any of that type of documentation that describes what you're looking to do as an organization and how those values translate down into what your individual contributors and departments need to be doing. That's what's important to meet this criteria. So this section, the entity demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals in alignment with objectives. So this all starts with the hiring process, all the way from job posting to interview to background check to hire, right? So during the job posting and in the interview process, is it made clear to the candidate? Is the candidate evaluated on whether or not they'll be able to not only perform the job function, but meet the ethical requirements that were defined earlier by the highest level in the organization? And how do you determine that, both the technical side and the ethical side? And background checks is one tool to do that. That's one way to satisfy that condition. What seems to happen is that This is the end. And remember that this control talks about develop and retain competent individuals, not just attract and hire. In fact, hire is not even in the control text. Once you find that right person, how do they know what to do? Do you have policies and procedures well defined? It's very likely that you have policies well defined for going through a SOC 2 assessment and project to begin with. Do you have procedures defined for everything? How does development and feedback happen? How does the new employee know during the beginning, and even existing employees as you go forward, are they meeting your objectives in addition to just performing the work? Is there some kind of feedback mechanism? Is there some kind of review? And we'll get more into that in the next control discussion. But I just want to point out in this one in particular, it's really important to remember that this doesn't end after the hiring process. This goes on, and those develop and retain portion of this is just as important as the attract and hire. 1.5 talks about the entity holds individuals accountable for their internal control responsibilities. And what does that mean? So your internal employees, how are you making sure that they are actually performing the types of actions that you had them agree to when they signed the handbook and when they were sitting at the department meetings? And there's a couple things to do that, and particularly as they concern an MSP. The most common thing is talking about performance reviews. In fact, I've known some organizations that think that that is the entire intent of this control. And while they are important, there's a couple of things with that. One is performance reviews tend to only occur once every 6 months at most. Some are yearly, some don't even have them at all. And that's not frequent enough to give real actionable feedback to an individual about whether they are or aren't meeting your organizational criteria. At a high level, it certainly is, but as far as day-to-day corrective action, it isn't. KPIs are another thing to really think about, whether they're appropriate for meeting this requirement as an MSP, and let me explain that. It's very common to have KPIs in MSPs about things like how many tickets were closed, or how many hours were billed, or what was the average response time, or missed SLA time, or things like that. And while those might be important in your organization, they also might not be. And so you just really need to think about whether those types of KPIs are an accurate measurement of whether the individual is meeting the organizational objective that you established earlier in this section. And it might be in your organization, it might be in your organization, you might feel that that isn't sufficient. And just do that evaluation for yourself. The final thing I want to talk about is department level meetings, not necessarily department level. This could be team level or any other business unit or organizational unit. And this is a good way to demonstrate that you are at least weekly, right? Usually meetings are weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, talking about what things are going on in the organization and what people are doing and whether or not they're currently meeting objectives. And it's a great way to demonstrate that there's kind of one-on-one or more immediate feedback in addition to things that come from raw numbers or performance reviews. That completes our discussion of the SOC 2 control environment section, which is all about your company's overall strategy towards security and how that's communicated and reinforced. This one can be pretty dry, so thanks for hanging in there. We'll be talking about risk assessments next.